Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. Over the last couple of years, if people have been enjoying our program from all over the world, you realize that we've always been approaching the subject about thought and about brain function, to realize that it has many ways that it can stem into the ability to be able to have clear mental health, all the way to some that's kind of a little bit cloudy. Now, you take a look at some of the implications as far as it goes with success or failure, and that goes for many different things, such as attracting the love of your life or not, attracting the kind of wealth and abundance or not, or having the kind of life that you'd like to have or not, as well as physical health and well-being. Now, many of us, we may go out, we may pick off the shelves, or we may attend seminars to find ways that we can optimize our performance, our physical health, as well as attracting all the things that we'd like to experience within our lives. But why is it that we always seem to fall short? Well, you might find out through listening to our program today that it's not so much a matter of being able to reach out there and find out what it is that we can do to improve ourselves, but how we can maybe start from the core, the inside out, and see when we find things on the outside of us beginning to manifest. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's going to present a technology that's actually been around for a while but seems to be really on the cutting edge this day and age, just due to the fact that technology has just been so rampant about improving. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest who has discovered what is known as brain state technologies after looking independently into research related to neurofeedback and its effectiveness toward healing with a wide range of mental issues. Her desire to affect real positive change in individuals focusing on holistic healing using the mind-body connection. Her own story is dealing with depression and ADD and is the first and best qualification for doing what she does now, training other people's brains. Being a registered nurse allows her to understand and apply technology to brain function. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Adrienne Nicole, as we discover what we can do to train our brain. And Adrienne Nicole, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. I'm excited to be here and to share a little bit about about the brain with your listeners.
Nothing about talking about the big brains on our listeners, I always say.
Yeah.
Now, it's interesting. I remember back in about the early 90s as I was exploring the possibilities of how you can understand and heal ADD, which almost seems to be something that in today's society is almost like 1 out of every 3 people anymore. It becomes what you might call a phenomenon in many ways, is to find out, how we can do something about changing this so people can live and function better in society and, achieve their goals. And I remember hearing something about what we're about to talk about then. Let's talk about what this is, this brain training that might encourage people to realize that there is hope out there.
Absolutely. Well, neurofeedback is non-invasive training in brain function based on information gathered from an EEG, which is electroencephalogram equipment. Sensors are placed upon the person's head in various specific places that pick up brainwave activity. And we get to see how the brainwave activity is manifesting in the brain and all the different lobes, left and right hemispheres. And that information is fed back into a computer where the brainwaves are translated into sounds or musical tones that represent optimum patterns for the brain to function at any given location. And when we can give the brain a means of observing itself, we can encourage some brain patterns and discourage others. So like in the case of ADD, that's a focus problem. And, living in today's internet age, it's very hard to have focus, and like you said, 1 in 3 people probably have it, and it's hard to regain that focus again. So when you can allow the brain to let go of these patterns that cause problems between the mind and body and grow new pathways for optimum functioning, the end result is that the brain's electrical energies are balanced and harmonized, and they result in better functioning for you.
Mm-hmm. I know that it was just not too long ago, say a few years ago, there was a movie that came out, What the Bleep Do We Know? And they were talking about how we can get into patterns through belief and that it also goes to a deeper, more cellular level. And they were showing how when you get into a pattern, that's sort of how, your brain cells, if you will, begin to connect and create synapse patterns where you're in that, and they were trying to tell, or they were showing how on a biochemical level that you can begin to change your reality. This is kind of one of the ways that brain training works, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The brain has been encouraged through many, many years of evolution to help us survive, not necessarily thrive. And there are patterns that we develop that help keep us alive, and those patterns that help keep us alive are the ones that stay. And so when you work those patterns over and over, you make those patterns deeper and deeper.
Now, that's really fascinating. Now, what, Adrienne, got you involved in brain training?
Well, I had a friend who has, over the years, been interested in a lot of different healing modalities, and having an open mind, I love talking with him about this stuff, and he came down to visit me one weekend, and he was on his way to go visit some float tanks in the Portland area, where you're floating in a sensory deprivation type of environment. And he brought me back some information about these float tanks. And while I wasn't interested in floating, I noticed that in this information there was a lot of information about brainwaves. And I made the connection from that document that he brought me back between brainwaves and behavior. And like most people, I hopped on the internet and I started searching and narrowing things down and whittling it down. And the further I got down the rabbit hole, so to speak, I discovered neurofeedback. And that's how it all came about. One thing led to another.
Now, I think what's really fascinating, remembering back in the day when I was, reading about this in a book about how to heal, cure, or at least cope with ADD, is the idea that, as you were talking about earlier in the program, is that you hook up different nodes, if you will, to a person's brain so that it can be registered. And what they were talking about in this particular book is how what you start to basically do, just for our listeners out there, is that you kind of like play a video game into where your mind actually controls what's going on onto the screen. Now, I know that as you were talking earlier, that technology has improved so much that when it comes to playing games, if you will, that it's exceeded far beyond that. Now, talk about what the process is as someone does brain training.
Well, the process is the repetition of these 70-minute neurofeedback sessions that we do with Brain State Technologies. And it leads to the improved cognitive function and improved emotional control. The work is really success-oriented rather than deficit-focused. We encourage some brainwave patterns and we discourage others. When you were speaking about the video game earlier, we do have some of those capabilities within our software. For instance, we have a Pac-Man game that can be played, and when the brain is in that kind of optimum patterning and is operating in such a way that the frequencies that the protocol is encouraging the brain to go towards are being met, the little Pac-Man moves across the screen and starts gobbling up the dots. And as we go forward with all these protocols, the brain's lobes gets more integrated, balanced, and harmonized. So these dysfunctions and the hormonal or the neurotransmitters deficiencies are brought back into balance so the body can function properly.
Now, as someone approaches you, apparently, from what I understand, there are a lot of mental healing, approaches that brain training can accomplish. Now, I know there's a book out there titled Limitless You, which is written by the founder, if you will, of Brain State Technologies. And he was sharing many fascinating stories throughout this whole book about the types of things that people come in for. Now, one thing we've covered on our particular program, for instance, especially for the veterans out there, is post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, talk about why, if you can, why conventional mental health practices, which are good, such as talk therapy or seeing a therapist, they can work, but maybe they just don't help with the whole picture, and how something like brain training might get to a deeper level of helping somebody kind of get back into a line after such an experience.
Sure. Neurofeedback is great for PTSD because it allows someone to connect with those deeper trauma imprints or memories, if you will, in a way that allows them to process it and discharge the emotional connection that they have with that event. I don't want to get too far deep into the, brain science behind this, but memories are stored in about 4 different locations in the brain. And when you go through memory recall, you've got to access those 4 areas, and you've got to be able to integrate it and put it back together in a way that's a cohesive memory. And sometimes it's very hard when you are a sufferer of PTSD or a particularly traumatic event to integrate those in a way that's meaningful and allows you to figure out what it is that you had problems with and why it has such an emotional charge over you. So when we can do something like deeper state training or alpha theta training with victims of PTSD, we can get them to make that connection between the subconscious mind and the conscious mind and allow them to process that memory that's more beneficial for them and advantageous and allows them to get rid of that emotional charge associated with that event.
Now, that's interesting that you bring up emotional charge, because as we've been doing our program, people begin to realize, we've even received emails to say, I never really thought about my life being led that way before. If, for instance, you may be going to work every day and you're going about your business, but then all of a sudden your boss shows up and you find that you get this little churn in your stomach. You have no idea, your boss has never chewed you out about anything before, or you may be getting into relationships that seem to have particular patterns. Well, pay attention to what the emotional charge is that you're having behind that. And you come to realize that what you're discussing with us here today is that what you think you become, what you become habits. And then pretty soon you just start seeing yourself in a situation that's almost cyclical, and you just keep continually repeating patterns, sometimes without even being aware of it. It's almost unconscious.
Absolutely. And that's also the patterning behind addiction as well. You get into a habit, and then that habit becomes your reality.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's an interesting thing to talk about with our listeners out there, because there are probably people out there that have tried going to recovery programs. They know they just want to stop because having a particular addiction just isn't working for them. Now, what is it about brain training, if it does in fact work? How well does it work for addictions, and why?
It works really well for addictions, and the reason why is because it allows the person to, when the brain becomes more balanced and harmonized, they're finding that they don't even think about needing or wanting that substance that they had been using in the first place. And Lee Gerdes, the CEO of BrainState, he talks about a client who was a longtime substance abuse user, and this person would wake up every day and tell himself, today I'm not going to drink, and that's how he would start out every day. But after this person went through brain training, he found that he forgot to wake up and remind himself that he didn't need to do it anymore. It became a non-issue. And I know that doesn't sound very, very important, but it's a very potent idea to go from thinking I'm not going to use and telling yourself I'm not going to use today to not even having it register anymore.
Not even thinking about it, for instance.
Yeah. And when you can give someone more control over impulses, and when you can kind of disengage that emotional charge that's associated with habits, that's a pretty powerful thing.
Mm-hmm. I know that you take a look at something like this, for instance, addictions, for anybody out there who may have an inclination that after work they want to go and have a drink. It leads to several drinks, and before you know it, you're in another fog, and the next day you're saying to yourself, well, I'm never going to do that again. I'm going to slow down this week. But then by the end of the day, you find yourself in the same pattern again and again and again, and you go, wonder if there's any hope for this. And you pay attention to those thoughts, and it sounds to me, Nicole, that from doing brain training, that it just changes the way you think in those areas altogether. How is that?
It just does. It just does. I can't really offer you a precise example for that other than the one that I previously mentioned. Your mindset is different because you're in balance and harmony in between your lobes, and you are not feeling the need to self-medicate.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps I can expand on that a little bit. When you are out of balance and out of harmony, that's the reason why people turn to drugs and alcohol, because they're looking to manipulate their brain state. And that's how it all begins. And they find that it gives them a little bit more control, but it's false control, and it's not long-lasting or sustainable control, which is why it becomes a habit.
I know when I was reading about ADD, as I was mentioning earlier in the program, back in the early 90s, is that's what they were talking about, self-medication. Now, I myself had never thought about it that way before. That self-medication, well, that makes sense. And as I would describe to people when I would, drink alcohol, is that it gave me a feeling like I was shutting down all the noise that was around me.
Yeah.
So it gave you a nice, safe place to be. And, it's almost like a meditative state, but again, it's kind of like going into the castle and then being catapulted out of it without any kind of permanent, relief in any way, shape, or form. What kind of relief would you say people who do brain training experience, giving ADD as an example? What kind of things have people told you about?
Sure. Well, to kind of go back to how you started, the addiction clients, they tend to have great autonomic nervous system imbalances. And urge and imbalance are really one and of the same. Mm-hmm. And when you balance the brain, and it just leads you to places you never thought possible before. It makes your life more robust and full, and it returns the potential to your life in a way that allows you to expand and go forward further than you had thought before.
Mm-hmm. And describe for us, if you can, the people that you've worked with and, how they have talked to you about the changes they've experienced.
Oh, yeah, the changes in clients have been really, really phenomenal. And clients really do describe this as a life-changing event. I've had a wide range of clients. Most recently, I've been working with some Asperger's clients, and when you can calm down the frontal lobes for somebody, you mentioned in your previous question about ADD, that is a frontal lobe imbalance where you have a lot of low frequencies. And the frontal lobes are our workhorses of our brain, and they like higher frequencies. But when there's low frequencies that predominate up there, people are in a fog. They can't think straight. They can't keep attention on one task, and they're kind of bopping back and forth, racing thoughts, so to speak. And when you can give that person more balance and harmony, their thoughts quiet down, they're able to focus, they have just a general clarity, and they're able to become a better participant in their own lives. It's phenomenal.
It's funny to bring that up. I keep remembering about a particular comedian that I enjoyed a couple of years ago, and people say, "What do you drink so much for?" And he says, "Because my brain, my mind, just thinks of it. I just can't get it to shut up."
Yeah.
and just imagine, that there are a lot of us out there living that way, and the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, is making a lot of money just due to things like, that. And if people can find a way, to be able to change that very naturally and in a very non-invasive way, and that's just seemingly almost like a miracle in itself. And this is a non-invasive procedure, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, the sensors that are on your head are just picking up your own brainwave activity. When the tones come out through the computer into little earbuds that go into your ear, you're being reflected back to you in real time, your brain's own activity. Because that activity is translated into sound, and so you're hearing it in like a 0.20 microsecond delay or something like that. It's incredibly small, and the brain notices that pattern, and the brain loves patterns, by the way. Look
at the way you live, for instance.
Absolutely, yeah. Your brain's working all the time to recognize patterns and make sense of our world around us. It tries to figure out why something's happening, if it fits a pattern, and what it can expect to happen next. So when your brain hears its own music produced by the computer, the translation of brainwaves into sound tones, it makes a connection between its own behavior, instability or dysregulation, and the tones it's hearing. And then it self-regulates.
Now, Nicole, and just saying that all by itself and how it self-regulates, that brings a very intriguing question to mind. Now, we tend to live in a society, okay, we want quicker, easier, faster, that sort of a thing. We think more and more and more is better. Now, in a situation like this, maybe a listener might be thinking, well, okay, it sounds to me, and, maybe correct me if I'm wrong as the listener out there, that as I'm hearing this, that there might be a sense that you can manipulate the brain into patterns, but it doesn't sound like that's what's happening here, that the brain actually moves to its natural state with assistance. So, the doing the more just doesn't sound like it's something that's possible with brain training, is it?
No, yeah, we have not figured out yet how to do any brainwashing or anything like that. If I did, I'd be in a totally different business. But yeah, the brain knows what's best for it, and when it sees its optimal state, it adopts it and moves towards that optimal state. And then through the repetition of the neurofeedback sessions, it remembers and it creates that pattern, and the pattern gets deeper, and you start using that pattern more often, and then that pattern of optimal brainwave function becomes your natural state.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I'd like to do, Nicole, if you could, for our listeners, is we'll kind of put a little bit of, biological science into it, and let's talk about brain waves, the different types that there are, and what their functions are, and then how brain training kind of works with these different areas.
Sure. Well, the brain's energies are at any given time a combination of gamma, beta, alpha, theta, and delta waves. And together they constitute your state of mind. So when there are slow or fast wave predominancy in lobes where they shouldn't be, it manifests as symptoms of ADHD or anxiety, for example. And in addition, there's brain cells that orchestrate oscillations of these brain waves that help govern behavior of other cells that are guided by those rhythms, such as like hormone-releasing cells of the pituitary, for example. So the different waves, like for instance, delta and theta are most commonly associated with sleep, especially delta. But as you move kind of up the from slow to fast wave frequencies, you move to alpha waves, and then beta waves, and then gamma, which are the highest, the fastest oscillating waves. Gamma waves are thought to be connected with our sense of intuition with ourselves. The beta waves are the high, fast frequency waves that we need up in our frontal cortex to help us process. We also want higher frequencies on the left side of the head rather than the right side of the head. Those fast frequencies are what allow us to do our tasks and to process. We want more alpha waves on the right side of the head. The right side of our head is our more conceptual side that's associated with colors and senses of things and distance between things, really abstract concepts that need more creative type functioning. And so when we can balance back and forth between the lobes and in between the hemispheres from right to left, back to front, those waves, and get kind of that awakened mind state of balance, we have an optimized brain pattern. And the brain loves it, and it adopts it very quickly.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that as we had talked before you coming on the program, there was something interesting that you brought up, especially when it comes to anger. Now, there is a whole industry out there. In fact, there was even a movie, Anger Management, that was created out there. Now, it's interesting what you shared with me about anger in and of itself. Could you please talk with us, our listening audience, about that?
Well, what did I share with you about anger?
It was the idea, because when you were talking about how the brain, you have the right and the left hemispheres, and the idea that sometimes information doesn't relay back and forth easily between that. And you realize that anger is just an emotional response, and many people have it, and sometimes they don't know why. So they take drugs or they go to therapy, they try to deal with it, but yet it just doesn't seem to go away. But when you talked to me about this, I thought to myself, wow, what an interesting approach.
Yeah, anger is an inward frustration of the inability to pass information back and forth across the midline of your brain. We've got these fibers that run in between the left and the right hemisphere, and they're connective fibers. And I think it's a misnomer. People think, oh, I'm left-brained or I'm right-brained, but the truth is that we're using both sides of our brain at any given time. Sure, we have a predominancy. Like, for instance, if we are planning out our grocery list, we will predominantly be using the left side of our brain. Whereas if we are painting on a canvas, we'll be predominantly using the right side of our brain. But when the connection fibers and the energy that runs through that midline doesn't allow connection between the two hemispheres, there's a sense of frustration. And when that frustration builds, it can quickly lead to anger in people. And so when we can increase the integration between those two sides of the brain, we find a lot of times that people are more able to control their anger.
Now, does it seem that after people do brain training sessions that they just seem happier after a while?
Yeah, they do. That is probably one of the quickest benefits. There's a sense of happiness and there's a sense of contentment that comes over someone after doing brain training. It's kind of like somebody just says, finally I can relax and I can just be who I am, and there's none of that internal chatter or those racing thoughts that are running in the background anymore.
Amazing stuff. Now, what is your particular specialty when it comes to brain training? What do you really like to help people with most often?
Well, my specialty really is depression and anxiety and ADHD. And I also do a lot of PTSD work too. Having a Western medical background, I have a unique understanding of, our modern medical environment. And I think a lot of people are coming from that environment, but they're interested in more holistic health because they're starting to see that more preventative practices can lead to a larger whole for themselves, which is the basis of holistic practice, holistic medicine. So, having had depression myself and having had ADD, as you said in the intro, it's the first and best qualification for doing what I do now. And being an RN allows me to understand it and apply that technology to brain function. My nursing background gave me a lot of techniques to assist people with stress management and stress reduction, as well as facilitating change. One of my goals is to help people reduce and eliminate their medications that they use, because a lot of times these pharmaceuticals have side effect profiles that you don't quite bargain for when you start taking something. You start taking something because you want relief from your main problem, but a lot of times it ends up causing other problems, unforeseen problems. And it's really neat when I can help somebody, like I have done recently, get completely off their ADD medicine.
Yeah, that stuff, from what I remember as a child, I myself having ADD symptoms, if you will, I believe it was Ritalin. I mean, that stuff can just turn you into a zombie. I mean, what's the idea of functioning like that?
Yeah, I know. And the thing is that all these different drugs, they have that some of them work for some people and some of them don't work. And a lot of times people find that they've got to change drugs halfway into a drug regimen. And I'm not advocating for elimination of all drugs, because I think there's some benefit there. But I think when somebody finds that they can exert more control over their body and their mind, their needs for those kind of things lessen.
That's a very interesting statement that you have there, Nicole, is because we tend to turn outside of ourselves because perhaps we feel we've lost control.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of the Wizard of Oz, where the good witch says, "You've been there all the time." And you think, okay, well, that may be true, but how do I do that? And it sounds to me that brain training, as you've been saying throughout the program, is the way the brain and you get to see yourself and how you realize you can actually access that ability to get yourself snapped back into who you truly are. That's very exciting.
Yeah, it is really exciting.
Now, here's what was interesting when you were bringing up the idea of pharmaceuticals is as you pay attention to any of the commercials, and it's been more and more interesting this day and age. Who knows whether the Food and Drug Administration has anything to do with this. But I remember back in the day when you would see a commercial on television, usually during prime time, there was an unknown symptom that would come up that was brought up. I didn't know I had that. Maybe I should go and take that. Yeah. And that was the end of it, and everybody was in bliss. But now they rattle off a whole list of possible side effects. Do you think, okay, I'm eliminating one symptom for possibly gaining all these other things, but the whole idea behind, usually call it the sales pitch, if you will, was that this is sort of a one thing fits all in everybody. But apparently, from what I'm hearing here about brain training, this here is very individual.
Yeah, it is very individual. We that's how brain state is different than, say, other traditional neurofeedback providers. Brain state is more of a quantum physics type approach, whereas traditional neurofeedback is more of a Newtonian physics type approach. And I don't know that I really want to talk about physics. I don't think I'm qualified to really talk about physics. But the difference is that we kind of look at everybody's brains like we look at fingerprints. My brain is different than your brain, and you wouldn't want your brain to be at the exact same frequencies my brain's at. It wouldn't be optimal for your brain. And that's what's interesting about what BrainState's tool allows us to do for individuals, because we can look at somebody's brain and after balancing and harmonizing for that person, my brain map is going to look very different than your brain map. Mm-hmm. And we all come to brain training with different looking brain maps. And when we end, they don't look the same either. But the end result is very similar in the fact that when we give people more control over their brains, a lot of these dysfunctions tend to fall away, and relief is achieved. Clarity, joy, all those things come with that balanced brain.
Fascinating implications here. Now, how can people find out more about the work that you do, and are more and more people facilitating these kinds of, I guess, for lack of a better word, workshops?
Yeah, more and more people are. I know BrainState's got over 130 different affiliates in about 17 countries.
Wow.
And and it's really rapidly expanding. I think since the beginning of the year 2000, the number of neurofeedback providers in general has more than doubled, if I am recalling the right statistic here. So neurofeedback is really on its way up. And, BrainState has the largest collection of brain maps. I think they've got over 18,000 brain maps now. And the more brain maps they get, the better the software tool gets at detecting patterns in brains. And I know, for instance, if you want to hear more, I'm going to be at the Whole Foods in Vancouver on Thursday night this week at 6 o'clock, and I'll be giving a talk about what a balanced brain looks like. I'll be showing what a brain map is and talking about specifics in just different conditions that people come see me for: ADHD, PTSD, more cognitive control, Asperger's, anxiety, and we'll be talking about more of those specific things. So, I think in any given city there is, in the United States here, there's a Brain State affiliate, and here, I'm pretty accessible here in the Portland area myself, so.
Now, Adrian, if you could, please go ahead and give out a website where people who listen to this program can just find out more about what Brain States training is.
Sure. Well, my website is www.hbneuro, which is neuro.com. And if you want to find more about Brain State in general, you could go to www.brainstatetech, BrainStateTech.com.
Well, it's always very exciting to not only find out new healing modalities that are out there, but also to encourage our listeners. These have been around for a while, and if they didn't have effectiveness, they wouldn't be growing at the rate that they do. And Adrian, Nicole, it's been a pleasure to have you here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it.
You bet. So we also encourage you listeners out there, be sure to go out there and visit that website as she has suggested, which is HBNeuro, that is HBNEURO.com, to find out how brain training can help you be able to eliminate all those little things that keep you from having the life that you want to have, to make things perhaps a little easier, sleep a little better, and just be happy in general. We also encourage you to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50 with a 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. Also be sure to visit us on our blog, where we also post and archive our shows that you can enjoy at your convenience as well as share with others. Thank you again for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past happily.